Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
All right, welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Forgive me for interrupting the intro, but those of you who have heard any number of episodes of my program know that I like to play that line from the immortal Rod Steiger's unmatched portrayal of Pontius Pilate, and what is the truth? Well, in nearly 100 episodes now, I've never ventured to answer that question. Until now, that is. For the 99th episode of my show, the time has finally come in the History of Being Human podcast and Know Thyself History podcast, which are one and the same podcast, simply retitled, to attempt to answer Pilate's question, what is truth? That's right, because the way it's presented in my podcast, the recording from that movie in which Rod Steiger plays Pilate, he asked, what is the truth? But that's not what Pilate asked. Pilate asked, what is truth? Not what is a truth, not what is the truth, not what is one or other particular truth, but what is truth? Now, before you click out of this episode and try to find the latest celebrity home makeover, let me just admit, I know this sounds ponderous, if not downright tedious. After all, I'm not going to be looking into any particular truths of history, but into the nature and scope of truth itself. I'm not going to be asking if it's true that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. That's a historical question. I'm not going to be asking if it's true that COVID vaccines magnetize people's blood. That is a pseudoscientific question. Instead, I'm going to be asking, what does it mean when we say that something is true? For example, what does it mean when we say it's true that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon? This, my hopefully very patient listener, is a meaning question, a meta question, and it is known as the philosophical problem of truth that wrestles with the very nature and scope of truth itself, as I was saying. This philosophical problem of truth might strike you as contrived. Just another example of philosophers complexifying something intuitive or trivial, because after all, that's just the kind of pesky trolls philosophers are. True is true, false is false. You can't make it any more simple than that. And we all have a firm grasp on what it means to be one or the other, false or true. But I can assure you that when questioned even a little, when you get pushed back just a little, truth itself proves to be a far more slippery concept than you might expect. In a nod to history, since this is ostensibly and often a history-based podcast, let me say this: the philosophical problem of truth, the formal, argued, reasoned inquiry into the meaning of truth has been with us for a very long time. At the very beginnings of Athenian philosophy in the 4th century BC, Plato and Aristotle both offered their explanations of truth. For Plato, truth could only be known as it related to a complex arrangement of the universe that he posited. Truth for Plato was not to be found in this material world, this world of imperfection, transience, illusion. Truth with a capital T could only be apprehended by taking a philosophical journey to the metaphysical realm of what Plato called the forms, the eternal ideas. Aristotle, Plato's student, rejected that metaphysical explanation. He put it much more succinctly. You can't make it any more clear than this. That's the beauty of Aristotle. He said, quote, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. While to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true." End quote. In the story of Jesus before Pilate that I have already alluded to, in the Gospel of John, Pilate asked Jesus if he is the king of the Jews, and he receives this very cryptic answer from Jesus in John chapter 18, quote, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I have been born and come into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone that is on the side of truth listens to me." End quote. What was this truth for Jesus? Jesus was a Galilean Jewish holy man. If John's account is accurate, it seems to have been a particular religious truth that Jesus was referring to, specifically the truth of Jesus' own divinely sanctioned status and mission. Pilate, a Roman nobleman, we have to assume had a classical education with a hearty helping of Greek philosophy, does not seem willing to take the bait on these pious truth claims. And so Pilate responds with disinterest, if not downright contempt. He says, "What is truth?" And that's the end of the conversation. No answer is given. Pilate apparently goes on to what he considered more weighty matters. Throughout the Middle Ages, the ages of faith, truth is considered a province of the divine. And some of that divine influence on truth can be carried over even into the modern and romantic eras. They still write truth with a capital T in modern and romantic era prose, as if it were a proper name, like some kind of self-existing entity. Truth was a poetic device for these authors, an aspirational thing existing somewhere, which could be searched for and found. And when you found the truth, when you arrived at truth, you would inhabit the same lofty space as every other earnest seeker throughout history. And it was not just any old thing, it was the loftiest treasure, greatly to be sought after. As the words of this religious hymn state, quote, "Yes, say what is truth. 'Tis the brightest prize to which mortals or gods can aspire. Go search in the depths where it glittering lies, or ascend in pursuit to the loftiest skies. 'Tis an aim for the noblest desires." End quote. This elevation of truth persisted in the writings of the American transcendentalists, where you encounter things like this sentiment from Thoreau, quote, "Rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth." End quote. That's from Walton. Now, sadly or not sadly, truth, that Enlightenment truth with a capital T, took a terrible drubbing at the hands of existentialist and postmodernist philosophers. It was demoted in status from objective to subjective, from eternal to situational, from universal to dependent on a particular language or culture. Even the worth of truth came into question, as in these lines from Nietzsche, quote, "The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. To renounce false judgments would be to renounce life, would be to deny life. To recognize untruth as a condition of life, that, to be sure, means to resist customary value sentiments in a dangerous fashion. And a philosophy which ventures to do so places itself by that act alone beyond good and evil." End quote. Now that's the famous aphorism 333, from Beyond Good and Evil. And that struck me the first time I read it as an undergrad, the way it had struck educated Europeans a century earlier. It rousted me from my dream of this orderly world of objective and universal truth, and introduced me into this diminished realm, I guess you could say, where truth values are cynically pragmatic. Despite the fact that the problem of truth has been with us for millennia, it remains a current concern of many philosophers. In fact, more work has been done on the problem of truth in the past century than at any other time in the past, like having a truth renaissance. And so today we're going to dig into the nature of truth, the philosophical problem of truth. Simply put, we're going to try to answer Pilate's old question. And I can promise you this, there's nothing in the discussion coming up that's so specialized that it's going to be out of the reach of pretty much everybody. A lot of it makes sense. It seems kind of intuitive. And as always on the History of Being Human podcast, we're going to keep it big picture. And I actually think it's very relevant in our day when people talk about things like alternate facts, my truth, and your truth. When people consider bare assertions a sufficient argument to establish a point. When mere opinion is given the status of truth. And when, let's face it, there is almost a nihilistic abandonment of truth in our public discourse. Truth is a mere inconvenience at best. Nobody cares if you tell the truth or tell barefaced lies. I think the topic is particularly timely, as I said. And so today in this podcast, we're going to be pursuing that particularly elusive quality, truth. All right, so like I said, I want to keep this big picture. So the first big picture point that I need to address is what kinds of things can be true or false. There are a lot of ways we use the word truth that have nothing to do with today's discussion, nothing to do with the philosophical problem of truth. For example, we talk about a true friend. What do we mean by that? We just mean a sincere and earnest friend, somebody you can count on. We talk about false teeth, but that's not really truth or falsity. That's more like artificial or natural. Talk about a true Scotsman. In that sense, we usually mean something that is 100% bona fide Scotsman. But this has nothing to do with the philosophical problem of truth. When I talk about truth, for the purposes of this discussion today, truth is a property of ideas, opinions, beliefs. Because you can have a true or false idea, or opinion, or belief, in the philosophical sense of truth. those kinds of things have what's called a truth value. They can be false or they can be true. Really, what we're talking about is propositions. Propositions are the things that have truth values. A proposition could be true or false. Now, of course, I'm not talking about a proposition where you proposition somebody at a bar. In philosophy, a proposition is a specific thing. The word proposition means a statement that makes a claim. It asserts something. So, for example, a proposition would be, dogs are larger than fleas. That statement makes a claim. And because it makes a claim, it can have a truth value. In this case, since dogs are larger than fleas, we would say the truth value of the proposition dogs are larger than fleas is true. Contrast that with me saying, I am broadcasting from the moon. The truth value of that assertion, since I'm making a claim, an assertion, I'm asserting something, that is a proposition. I am broadcasting from the moon. The truth value of that proposition is false. In fact, as people trying to understand the world, trying to understand the universe around us, many of our beliefs and our ideas about the world and the universe can take the form of propositions, so they can be true or false. So, for example, I believe the earth is round. That can be stated as a proposition. So that belief can have a truth value, the truth value of true if the earth is indeed round. Since most of our beliefs, ideas, and opinions can be put into the form of a proposition, they can be true or false. I don't want to belabor this too much. It's pretty obvious. A proposition is an assertion. It makes a claim. And it's pretty easy to tell propositions from non-propositions. For example, if I tell you to close the door, that's not a proposition. I'm not making any kind of claim. I'm telling you to do something. If I ask you what time it is, that's not making any kind of claim. I'm seeking information. So those are not propositions. And you can't really call them true or false. And again, so far so good. All of this is pretty obvious. But there are some gray areas that aren't so obvious. For example, what about nonsensical statements? What if I make the proposition that a Jabberwock is more frumious than a Bandersnatch? Does that have a truth value? Many people with common sense would say that's false because a Jabberwock doesn't exist, so it can't be any more frumious than anything else. But most philosophers, instead of calling that false, would say that doesn't even rise to the level of a proposition that could have a truth value. The terms are completely nonsensical. There are no Jabberwocks, there are no Bandersnatches, and there's no such scale as frumiousness by which to judge them. So nonsensical propositions have no truth value, according to most philosophers. And most of them would say that paradoxical statements don't really have a truth value either. Theological paradoxes often fall under this category. Like the old question if God could make a burrito so hot he could never eat it, or a car so fast he could never drive it, or a pitch so fast he could never catch it. Those could be put in the form of a proposition. You could say, God could make a pitch so fast he could never catch it. And that certainly sounds like you're making a claim. Sounds like it should have a truth value. But if it's true, it leads to a paradox, and if it's false, it leads to a paradox. So many philosophers reject the truth value of paradoxical propositions. Say that 5 times fast. Maybe the most difficult kind of proposition of all to parse out, to see if it has any truth value or not, are claims about the future. Does the proposition, I will go to the post office tomorrow, have a truth value? At the time I say it. So if I say right now, I will go to the post office tomorrow, does that statement have a truth value at the moment I utter it? And most philosophers would say, no, that doesn't have a truth value. That's a proposition making a claim about the future that can only be contingently true or false, depending on what happens in the future. But at the time you make a promise, or express an intention, or make some claim about the future, does it have a truth value? That's a very difficult question. And again, I'm not going to get into all the nuance around that. And the one final special case that I want to point out is moral statements. If I make the claim, torturing goats is wrong, am I asserting a fact? Is this really a proposition? Or am I just simply expressing some of my feelings about the matter? Many philosophers would claim that those kind of moral statements, those moral propositions, or even aesthetic judgments, can't be really true or false. They're just your personal preference. For now, let's just keep it very simple. Let's make a definition. Make it tautological. A proposition is a statement that asserts something that could either be true or false. If it couldn't be true or false, if it has no truth value, it's not a proposition. Our ideas, opinions, and beliefs can usually be put into the form of a proposition. If they can be put into the form of a proposition, then they can be true or false. So yes, you can absolutely have a true opinion, a true belief, a true idea. So now the real question that we haven't even begun to answer yet is what makes a proposition true or false? Historically, and in pretty much every Philosophy 101 course, there are three main theories about how to assess whether a proposition is true or false. The first one I want to talk about is the one that we most commonly refer to. That's called the correspondence theory of truth. The key word there, of course, is correspondence. A proposition is true if, and only if, it corresponds to the actual nature of things, to some objective reality. If I have the belief or opinion that there's a pen on the table, if that corresponds to what's actually the case in reality, there actually is a pen on the table, then that statement or that belief is true. If I have the opinion that I'm the emperor of Rome, and I am indeed not the emperor of Rome, that doesn't correspond to reality, therefore that's a false belief or opinion. And I don't think most of us would disagree with this idea. It's really quite obvious and intuitive. We believe that there is an objective reality out there that's separate and distinct from our own internal mental world, which we would say is in here. Truth, therefore, is to be found when our internal mental image, our beliefs, our opinions, or the propositions we form from them, when those line up with what is out there. They line up with external reality. They correspond. That, in a nutshell, is the correspondence theory of truth. It has the great advantage of being very simple and intuitive. When we talk about truth, it's usually what we mean. But believe it or not, there are actually some problems with the correspondence theory of truth. And I don't know if problems is the right word. It may be more like limitations. There are areas that the correspondence theory of truth does not go. For example, logical propositions, the truths of mathematics, theoretical ideas of science, things that can't correlate, or at least that we can't prove correlate to any objective reality. What about moral propositions? To what objective reality are those supposed to correspond? Take just one example. Suppose you present Thanos with the proposition, killing half the sentient beings in the universe is morally wrong. And Thanos came back saying, no, killing half the sentient beings in the universe is morally right. How could you possibly decide which proposition was true and which one was false? There's no objective fact of the universe. You could point out to Thanos, people are going to suffer, there's going to be tremendous loss, they're all going to reproduce anyway, so you didn't accomplish anything in the long run. But Thanos would then come back with his arguments, and there is no objective criteria out there that proves morally right or morally wrong. So truth of moral statements, truth of theories, truth of propositions that can't be verified in some way eludes the correspondence theory of truth. So there are some limitations. So be it. So what, right? Well, that would all be well and good if there weren't a more fundamental objection to the correspondence theory of truth, one that strikes at its very heart. And it's as simple as this. You have no mind-independent access to reality. You have no way to apprehend or perceive an objective reality. It's all mind-dependent. It all is filtered through and presented to your mind. So how are you going to compare your thoughts to reality when even reality is a product of your thoughts? So in essence, all the correspondence theory of truth could prove in this situation is that truth arises when you can compare one thought to another thought, and those two thoughts agree. If you don't have mind-independent access to reality, you have no way of knowing if your thoughts correspond to reality, so you have no way of proving a proposition true. And so I understand that may sound like a quibble, a little too abstruse. And yet it really is a massive problem with the correspondence theory of truth. In fact, at an even more fundamental level, how do you decide the truth or falsity of the proposition, quote, the correspondence theory of truth is true, end quote? To what objective fact in reality could you point to help establish the truth or falsehood of that statement? So there's a little circularity in this system like there is in so many others. Which is why there are more theories of truth. We're going to talk about the next one called the coherence theory of truth. I wouldn't look at these theories of truth necessarily as competitors. In fact, they're usually complementary. We actually appeal to various theories of truth in our daily lives. Sometimes we describe truth as that which is objectively verifiable. Other times, though, we think of truth as fitting within a cohesive picture of the universe. That, in essence, is the coherence theory of truth. The truth of any proposition depends on it fitting within a given set of propositions, within a system. If it coheres within that system, we call it true. If it's an outlier, it doesn't fit into the system, we often consider it false. And so the beauty of this system, of course, is you don't have to make any claim that you have access to objective reality, that you can compare your mental image to something out there, and if it corresponds, it's true. No, in coherence theory, your truths have to be coherent. Things which are true cohere within a given system, a given set of propositions. And we rely on coherence theory all the time, whether we know it or not. As Thomas Kuhn pointed out, we all have a paradigm of the world. And when information from our senses doesn't fit that paradigm, we often reject it as false. Let me give you an example. Most of us driving down the freeway, at one time or another, are presented with the proposition that there is a large body of water on the road in front of us. It's called a mirage. We see what looks like a large body of water on the road in front of us. So how do you decide the truth or falsehood of the proposition that there is a large body of water on the road in front of you? Well, it corresponds to the actual sense data you're receiving, which is through your eyes. You can't smell it, of course, but you see a large body of water on the road in front of you. So it corresponds, as far as you can tell, to objective reality. And yet you know good and well there's no body of water on the road in front of you because it's not coherent. It doesn't cohere within your understanding of the world and driving and the road in front of you. In fact, it's by their lack of coherence that we often decide that illusions are illusory, hallucinations are indeed hallucinations, and in fact, it's the way that we tell that many of the propositions of physics or mathematics, like superstring theory, or some of the abstract theories in mathematics, that they are true or false. That's how we decide it. Do they cohere within the system? In fact, this is often the reason we have a difficult time accepting new ideas, because in essence, they seem to present us with a proposition that doesn't fit in our system. It breaks our paradigm. But that, in a nutshell, is the coherence theory of truth. To assign a truth value to a proposition, you see how well it fits with other propositions whose truth value you already accept. And so even though this is a totally separate theory of truth, the coherence theory of truth is different from the correspondence theory of truth. I think that they should be seen as complementary instead of contradictory, instead of competitive, because they both have their limitations. We talked about the limitations of the correspondence theory. What are the limitations of the coherence theory? Well, the big one should be obvious. You could construct a very coherent system. All of the propositions within that system could be considered true by the coherence theory of truth, and yet the system would completely not work. It wouldn't map anywhere onto reality. Like, what if you believed that everything that happened in the physical universe was the operations of angels and demons, and you had an elaborate hierarchy of angels and demons, and you could explain the truth or falsehood of every proposition from within your system? Well, I think all of us understand that that doesn't make it true, just because it cohered, just because it was internally consistent. Well, so is the Pokemon universe. And yet we don't describe that as the true universe. And we don't think we can tell the actual truth or falsehood of a proposition based on Pokemon cards or angel and demonology. And why is that? Well, because practically it doesn't correspond to any objective reality. So I think, again, these are complementary systems. When we really want to decide if something is true, not only do we compare it to other ideas, other propositions that we take as true, we also compare it as best we can to the objective physical universe. And unfortunately, this can lead us into clashes from time to time. Take, for example, fundamentalist religion, where you have certain tenets of your faith that seem to continually clash with the objective, quote-unquote, objective data that you're receiving from the world around you. Or there's the old joke about the wife who comes home and finds her husband cheating, and he says, "Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" Her coherent picture of her husband presents one truth to her, and yet the data from her eyes, the objective world around her, is presenting a very different piece of data. So there can be a clash there. Coherence theory can also lead to echo chambers. I think this is a very telling objection. If you're a religious conservative, if you're a political liberal, whatever you are, however you categorize yourself, you have an accepted set of propositions, and most propositions that come into your purview are tested by that existing set of propositions. You don't have to go outside your system to prove the truth or falsehood of any proposition, which is convenient, it's a shortcut, it's comfortable, but is it really true? So there are limitations to either system. But usually, ideally, these two theories of truth work together to help us assign a truth value to a proposition. I'm just going to talk about one more theory of truth before I wrap up this episode. I'm not going to talk about currently the most influential theory of truth. That's called the semantic theory of truth. I'll talk about that on the next episode. I'm just going to talk about one of the more historically important theories of truth. That's the pragmatic theory of truth. This is very easy to understand. It doesn't try to get to the actual correspondence of a proposition with some external reality. It doesn't really even care about the coherence of a proposition with the set of all other propositions in a given system. No, what is true is what works. The truth of a proposition is determined by whether or not it's useful in a certain way. As William James might have put it, the truth of a proposition is basically its cash value. It's what you can get out of it. If it works, it's true. If it doesn't work, it's false. The beauty of this theory is that it's pretty simplistic. You don't have to make any claim at getting to the ultimate reality of truth. There doesn't have to be an objective material universe. It doesn't have to cohere with any given system. All it has to do is work. To the extent it works, it's true. And I've oversimplified it, but not by much. The truth of a proposition is determined by how effectively and efficiently it allows you to interact with the universe. You don't even have to know if the universe is mental or physical or material or idealistic. It's just how effectively can you interact with that universe. Well, that's the pragmatic criterion for truth. And we have to admit there's a certain bullish effectiveness to it, a certain brutal elegance as it plows through all of the airy-fairy questions about the actual nature of reality. But despite this brutal efficiency, we have to admit it has very severe limitations. In fact, the biggest limitation of the pragmatic theory of truth is that it's not a theory of truth at all. It's a theory of what works. Many philosophers have, and I think justifiably, complained that the pragmatic theory of truth ignores or avoids or dodges the question of what's true rather than answering it. And the simple fact of the matter is, there are many propositions that we very well understand to be true that really don't work for us. So for example, take this statement, quote, "It is true that the book is on the shelf," end quote. Compare that with the pragmatic definition of truth, which leads to this statement, quote, "It is useful to believe that the book is on the shelf," end quote. According to the pragmatic theory of truth, those two statements are saying the exact same thing. Well, again, that seems absurd. We all know that that's not the same thing. We all know, for example, that a proposition can be both true and useless, or another proposition can be false and very useful. So to me, pragmatic theory of truth is again not really a theory of truth. How it came to be called a theory of truth, I'm not sure. I think the proponents of pragmatic theories named it that way. They would be very cynical about our ability to access the ultimate nature of reality, the fundamental nature of the physical universe, or the coherence within any system. So what are they left with? Kind of a defeatist, well, let's just see what works. So, as you can tell, I don't have a high opinion of pragmatic theories of truth. It's not because I don't care about what's useful or what works. I care deeply about what works, what's useful. Those are the most practical things you can know. But let's not call it truth, as if it's one and the same thing. All right, this has been the 99th episode since I began podcasting, the 49th of the History of Being Human, and before that we had 50 Know Thyself. The next episode will be the 100th podcast episode that I put out, and I need to come up with something so earth-shattering, so world-historic, so epic that it transcends everything else I've done before. I still have to talk about the semantic theory of truth, but that's not big enough, and I wish I could tell you what I'm going to talk about, but frankly I haven't even decided yet, but I will, and I'll be back with that. And until then, in truth, I hope you're well and thriving.